We're in Luke chapter 9 today, and we're only going to take a look at verses 11 through 17. I know that's not a lot of verses to concentrate on, but these handful of verses here really do demand an in-depth look, because what we're looking at in verses 11 through 17 is the miracle feeding of the 5,000. So it's one of those stories you probably had taught to you in Sunday school when you were just a little whippersnapper, just a young one. It's one of those few things that generally all people know about Jesus. I mean, if you know anything whatsoever about Jesus, you probably know that he turned the water into wine. You probably know that he fed the 5,000, and you probably know that he died on a cross. The winos like to bring up the one about, Jesus turning the water into wine. The foodies, the gourmands, like to bring up the miracle about the feeding of the 5,000. But those are very common miracles that Jesus did that most people know about. And we call this the miracle feeding of the 5,000. And I've always wondered why we call it that. Because if you know much about the story, if you've actually ever studied the story, you know that by the time that Jesus is done in this story, he feeds way more than 5,000 people. If you look down to verse 14 here in Luke 14, verse 14 specifically tells us that there were 5,000 men there. And it means exactly that. There were 5,000 men. And if you want to get a little more precise about this, you can hop on over to Matthew's account of this, Matthew chapter 14, verse 21. He makes that undeniable. Matthew says 5,000 men, not counting the women and the children. So if you just, put some numbers here together, you realize this was way more than 5,000 people. What the story is going to do is what the Jews usually did. They numbered large groups by the head of the homes. So they would count the men, and each man symbolized a family, a home. So when you read 5,000 men, understand that this crowd and this miracle that's going to take place involves 5,000 families of people. If you want to be really conservative with your guess on the size of this crowd, then you could take an average out each family, one man, one wife, husband and wife, and one kid. If you did just that, if the average was that every family had one kid, you'd come up with 15,000 people. Now, if you wanted to be a little less conservative, because that's ridiculously conservative, if you want to say, let's just average this out with a husband, a wife, and 2 kids for each family, you have 20,000 people now. It's still an extremely conservative number. Yes, I know there'd be some singles in the crowd that day. But listen, these were healthy Jewish families, and Jews usually didn't have only 2 kids. They had 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, kind of like the Pitts family. Big families, so you're looking at numbers probably way exceeding 20,000 people. It is by sheer number alone the biggest miracle that Jesus did as far as the number of people affected or blessed by the miracle. This is it. This is the big one. And I think all of the gospel writers agree, because this is one miracle, one of the handful of miracles that all 4 gospel writers record. So I guess you could say 4 out of 4 gospel writers agree this is an important miracle. Now, we're not going to talk about it today, but the bread that we're dealing with in this chapter is speaking of, symbolically, Christ himself. He told us that shortly after this. I'm the bread that comes down from heaven. That's me. I'm the food for your soul. That's the message. But we're going to take a look at the miracle here. And it's a big one, so are you ready? Big miracle. Here we go. Let's take a look. Verse 11. But when the multitudes knew it, that is, when they found out where Jesus and the disciples were, even though Jesus and the disciples were trying to get away from the crowd and rest and relax and recuperate from ministry, but yet when the crowds knew it, it says they followed him. and he received them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who had need of healing. So this is just Jesus showing tremendous flexibility. He's never too busy to minister to those in need. We see that countless times as we go through the Gospels. He's never too busy to stop what he's doing in order to meet someone's immediate need. Remember when he did that with Jairus? En route to heal the daughter of Jairus, which was going to turn into a death. En route to heal Jairus' daughter, he had no qualms about stopping and meeting the need of a woman there that had been suffering for 12 years from a condition. And even though he's exhausted and the disciples are exhausted from ministry, he's not too busy. He's very flexible, and he's not too busy to stop and meet these needs. Now, as I shared with the Wednesday night crowd, the Lord knows exactly how much to expect from you as a worker and as a servant in the kingdom. I shared Psalm 103:14, just a reminder to us that the Lord knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. He knows what we're made out of, dirt. And as I shared with the Wednesday crowd, he knows sometimes you need those few hours on the couch, and he knows you need those trips to the beach. He knows how frail we are, how weak we are, but this is as far as Jesus is concerned. He's never too busy to meet our needs, and all the more now because he's not limited by one human body that's stuck in this time and space continuum with us. He's free of that now. So there's no more lines to get to Jesus, no more Walmart lines. You know how they do that? Store full of people, one cashier, and everyone's in line. No lines to get to Jesus anymore. Very flexible. He is always there for us. Verse 12, when the day began to wear away, the 12 came and said to him, "Send the multitude away, that they may go into the surrounding towns and country and lodge and get provisions, for we are in a deserted place here." Now, one of the first things that you learn about ministry, and remember, this is a continuation from last week's message. We're looking at ministry principles in these two stories in the beginning section of Luke chapter 9. And I made it a point to make sure that you don't misunderstand what ministry is. Ministry is service. It's serving one another in the name of the Lord. So we all do that in some way, shape, or form. We're all serving one another, helping one another. Any help that you offer to a brother and sister in the church, that's ministry work, right? And one of the first things that we learn in this section about ministry is that ministry is not always convenient. Contrary to popular desire, other people's emergencies don't happen when you're enjoying your free time and your off time. A lot of times, other people's emergencies happen when you've just spent all day working and you sit down and you just lift that spoon to your mouth, that first bite of dinner. And there's that call, there's that emergency, there's that need. Someone in the church needs help, someone needs prayer. It usually happens that way. So, ministry. Principle number one from this section, ministry does not always happen when it's convenient. You know, there's that statement that floats around the internet that says, poor planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on my part. I kind of like that, and I'm tempted to post that a lot. But really, as a Christian servant, I can't be thinking that way. Neither should you. Yes, sometimes it's poor planning and it's poor decision making that gets your brothers and sisters into trouble. But is that any reason to shut them out and say, well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to finish this meal. We'll deal with your emergency later. I don't want it to inconvenience me. So a humble servant of the Lord is going to be flexible just like Jesus is as much as possible, even when the timing is very inconvenient. Jesus and his 12 disciples had been working for days. They had been doing ministry work for days. The disciples just got back from that missionary trip that Jesus empowered them for and sent them out on. And don't think for one moment that Jesus was wasting time while his disciples were out there ministering in surrounding villages, because Matthew 11, verse 1 tells us that while the disciples left their hometowns to go out into neighboring towns to minister, what was Jesus doing? Matthew 11:1 tells us Jesus went into their towns to minister, to preach the gospel. So he waited for them to leave their towns, and then he went into their towns to minister to those people. He was probably trying to fix all the errors and mistakes and problems that they caused in their own hometowns. That's just conjecture. Probably not true. But so Jesus was working too, that's the point. The disciples were working for days. Jesus was working. This day, above all, was a busy day, was an exhausting day. And when the multitudes follow them yet again, wanting more ministry, bringing more of their needs, the disciples and Jesus have two very different responses to the crowds. The disciples want the crowds gone. They're peopled out. They're worked out. They're burnt out. They're peopled out. I don't know if you get like that. You get peopled out. You get into crowds of people and it just kind of wears on you. And you get to the point where you're like, I just got to go home and be away from people. I get like that every now and then. But you got to understand my background. I am an introvert. Let me just put it like this. I was a hardcore introvert that trained himself to be a hardcore extrovert. And every now and then that introversion creeps back in and I revert to that introversion, and I get around people and I'm around them too long and I just say, I want to go home. I want to go home and be in my house with my family. I don't know if you're like that, but boy, the disciples are there at this point. They just want the crowd to go away. They're overworked. They're exhausted. They're peopled out. They probably put in more hours over these last handful of days than Pennsylvania pipeline workers, you know the kind of hours they put in. 60 and 70 hours a week. They're exhausted. They're done with the crowds. But Jesus is already on to the next need. Yes, he was setting up this time to recuperate, but something came up. There's another need that's out there among the multitude, and Jesus is already moving toward that next need. The disciples want that next need to maybe happen the next day or the first coming weekend, but Jesus is on to that next need immediately, and he wants to meet that need. He wants to continue to meet the needs of the people. He doesn't want to send the people away. Verse 13. But he said to them, you give them something to eat. Matthew's account adds that Jesus said, they don't need to depart. Lord, they're hungry. We're all worn out. Send them away. Let's kind of try to force them to go home. Jesus said, they don't need to depart. You give them something to eat. Why do you think he wants them to meet the need? Why does he want the disciples to meet the need? I mean, isn't this where Jesus says, hey guys, I know it's been a trying couple of days, but you guys just rest and let me handle this situation. You let me meet this need. That's kind of what I would expect from Jesus. But he says to the disciples, you meet the need. Why did he want the disciples to meet the need? Because they saw the need. They recognized the need. And the Lord likes to work that way. I don't know if you know this or not, but this is another ministry principle. Is that when the Lord is fixing, let's use some country terminology here, when the Lord is fixing to take care of some needs, how he usually begins to do it is he usually begins to stir the hearts of some people in the congregation. That's how he does it. So when you get those inspirations and you recognize the needs that we have in the local fellowship, and you bring those needs up to the pastor or to the board and you say, hey, the Lord has been laying it on my heart. It's been churning in me. I see this need in the fellowship. It's a weak spot. It's something we can do better in. Or I see people in certain conditions of need within the fellowship, and I think what the Lord is inspiring me to bring up to you is that we should start a ministry. That we should work a plan to meet this need or that need. And you look at me and you say, okay, now what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about the need? That's when I do what Jesus did. And I say, wait a minute now, you saw the need. The Lord was working in your heart to see that need, to see that weakness, to see that area where there's new room for new ministry. If the Lord's working that in you, chances are I'm going to turn back around to you and I'm going to say, you meet the need. You start the work. We'll get behind you in the fellowship. We'll throw support at you. You organize it. You run it. You take that need that you see and you let the Lord use you to meet that need. And then, of course, that's when people usually back out. Well, now that I think about it, not a real big deal. Not a big need. Not a major thing. So Mark chapter 6. Mark 6 is one of the parallel accounts to this story. And in Mark chapter 6, verses 36 and 37, Mark kind of straightens up the order of all of this for us. And he tells us that they requested to send the crowds away. And then Jesus said, no, you give them something to eat. And then after that, Mark tells us that Jesus intentionally turns to Philip and asks Philip this question. And actually, we'll hop over to John. John chapter 6, verse 5 and 6. Here's what he asked Philip. Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. So Jesus knows where he's going with this. He knows how this story is going to unfold. He knows how it's going to end. But he decides to first test the faith of the disciples again. You think these guys would catch on by now? Look, he's just going to keep testing us to see if we have faith. So everything he says to us, let's just be expecting that the answer is faith. He turns to them to test them, specifically Philip. Why Philip? Because this is Philip's hometown region. This is Bethsaida. Now, they're not in Bethsaida. They're on the outskirts of Bethsaida. They're in the deserted places around Bethsaida, that city. Kind of like being in Dunbar. Looking for a restaurant in Dunbar and a gas station. And they're on the outskirts in a deserted place. But Philip is from Bethsaida in this region. So here's what the Lord's working on here. He's not going about this to try to get some information. He's not like, just kind of all dry on ideas on how to fix this problem and fill these people's bellies and meet these needs. I think I'm going to have to recruit some help and ask the disciples, guys, you got any good ideas? No, Jesus is not out of ideas. What he's doing is not looking for suggestions on how to resolve the problem. What Christ is actually doing is he's eliminating all of the impossibilities. He's eliminating all other solutions to this problem so that he can move them to the place where they understand the only way to meet this gigantic need is a miracle. So he asked Philip, knowing the area, knowing what the local marketplaces are charging for bread, knowing how much money they have in the fellowship bank account. You know that, right? That Jesus and the 12 disciples had a little money bag that they carried around. And that was for ministry expenses. They left Judas Iscariot in charge of the money bag. He was the treasurer. That would have been a terrible choice if that wasn't intentional by Jesus. The guy that's a thief, put him in charge of the money, and sure enough, we find out later in the Gospels, he was stealing from the disciples' money bag the whole time. Money was going into the fellowship bank account, and he was lining his pockets. But Philip is the guy that would have all these answers. He knows the towns. He knows where they could go. He knows if they could find a bread store that would have this much bread to feed this big of a crowd. He knows how much that would cost. And so he asks Philip specifically, Because what Jesus wants to do is establish that, first off, there's not going to be any way that this little group of people can throw money at the problem and make the problem go away. That's what Jesus is doing. He's telling you right here that money is not going to solve this problem. In John chapter 6, verse 7, Philip, after he got out his abacus, his calculator, and ran the numbers. Let's see, how many we got out there in the crowd? 20-some thousand. All right. Let's see how much money we have in the fellowship bank account. 200 denarii. And here's Philip's response. John chapter 6, verse 7. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. So it's not going to work. We just don't have the funds in the church. A denarii was a day's wage. So they have 200 denarii. That's like 200 days worth of wage. That's what they have among the group. That is not a whole lot of money comparatively to run a ministry on. Their bank account there with Jesus and those 12 disciples was not a very big bank account. So it sounds like Jesus just didn't yet know about the prosperity doctrine. I guess Jesus had never heard Kenneth Copeland's teachings on how to give the Lord a little bit of money and get a whole bunch back in return. At one point, Jesus will have to ask someone, hey, do you have a coin? Let me see a coin. I want to do an example. We know that Jesus didn't have a house. He wasn't wealthy. Their little group wasn't wealthy. They didn't have a lot of money. So if there ever was a time in your life when you listened to Christian TV and believed in the prosperity doctrine, but wondered why it didn't work for you, well, don't feel bad. It didn't work for Jesus either. And he created all of spiritual life. So if he couldn't get it to work, it's not going to work for you. Just turn your TV off when they start saying that stuff. Anyway, check this out. If you like Bible numerology, you're going to like this one. The number 200 in the Bible, anytime you see that number 200 in the Bible, it always carries the meaning of insufficiency. That's what the number 200 means in the Bible. And that's exactly where they are. That's the number they have. That's the amount of money that they have. And what Philip has just determined is that their funds were insufficient to meet this need. Insufficient funds. You ever get that message on your bank account? Insufficient funds. Well, the fellowship there just got that letter. Sorry, Jesus and the 12, insufficient funds. You can't do this with money. Going to need something else. So Philip was saying, look, if we empty out our entire bank account and spend everything that we have on bread, first off, our ministry goes broke. And secondly, we won't even have enough to give everyone a tiny little bit of bread. In other words, like we can't even have a communion service with that money. That's not enough even to give everyone a little communion wafer. So this is not going to work. And that's perfect. Because that's the answer that Jesus wants. He's not looking for solutions. He's looking to completely eliminate all doable options so that he can provide a miraculous one. And since Jesus wants to feed this crowd and now they know that they don't have enough money to do it, they do the only reasonable thing to do at that point, and that's to start scouring the crowd to see how much food they can round up. So they start looking. Let's see how much food we have here. Maybe we can get something to work. And in John chapter 6, verse 9, we're told that in that crowd there was a little boy that apparently his mom had packed him a lunch for the day because that little boy had a lunch. He had, well, let's read it. Verse 13 continued. And they said, we have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish unless we go and buy food for all these people. So that's what they came up with. That was the food. That was the lunch that little boy had. He had 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And before we go too far with that, let's correct some misconceptions here. This was not 5 full big loaves of Stroman bread or Wonder Bread. It will be Wonder Bread in a sense, but not in that way. These weren't big loaves of bread. I mean, just use some common sense. There's no way you send your kid out in the morning to carry 5 big full loaves of bread all day with him for when he gets hungry. That's too much. I mean, that wouldn't even fit in those big old ugly tin lunch boxes we had when I was a kid. These are 5 pita bread size, like this big around and that flat. That's what these loaves were when you read about these loaves. That was a Jewish loaf. It looked like a piece of pita bread. And these fish, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not specific about the fish that was in the little boy's lunch. They all use the word ichthus, which means any kind of fish. By the way, that's the name of that Christian symbol, the fish that you see on the back of cars. It's called an ichthus. It's a Greek word for fish. It can be any size or any type of fish. But luckily for us, in John's gospel, he uses the word opsarion in the Greek. And we translate it in English as small fishes. So John gives us a more precise word to let us know. And when you look at that Greek word and what it really means, it means tiny little salted condiment fish. A little bigger than a sardine. These were called pickle fish. And that was what they had. 5 pita pockets and 2 sardines. Now remember that, because a whole lot is going to come from such a meager offering. So Andrew says in John chapter 6, verse 9, he says, yeah, Jesus, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish, but what is that among so many? And that's probably always going to be how you feel in the ministry. Remember, we're talking about ministry. These are lessons about ministry. And that's always how you're going to feel. It's always how you're going to feel when you're trying to help others. Lord, what I have to offer you seems so meager to me. My Bible knowledge is little. My prayer life is weak. My experience with you is little. There is no way that I can cover the need. The need is too great. But again, remember what ministry is from last week. Ministry is a partnership between you and God. That means you have your part, however small it might be, however meager it might be. And in that partnership, it also means that God has his part, and that's the part that really matters. Your part doesn't matter so much. That's just the starting point for what the Lord's going to do. It's when he joins his power into your part of the work, that's what really creates the miracles. That's what really gets the work done. You ever hear that old song, little is much when God is in it? Little is much when God is in it. So your willingness, even though that comes with all of your insufficiencies, your willingness and whatever it is that you offer is more than enough for what he needs in order to meet a gigantic need that is before you or another person. That's all he needs. Your willingness, and you can bring your insufficiencies all along with you. If you want, go home and read 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 31. Here's why the Lord does it this way, so that no flesh should glory in his presence. If God just deposited that power within me and gave me ownership of it, to use it however I wanted to use it, if he gave it to me as natural power and natural ability, I'd be laying hands on people and healing them. I'd be feeding people miraculously. I'd be doing all these things that Jesus was doing, and my head would get way too big. I'd be too big for my own britches. So the Lord uses the weaker things. the meager things. He uses the unlearned. He uses those that have no skills of oratory. He uses all of that so that when the results come, no flesh can glory in his presence. And then Paul says there in verse 31, let him who glories, or her too, let him or her who glories, glory in the Lord. Glory about his part, not your little part. Glory about his part. So the Lord is going to use this little lunch, and from this little lunch is going to come a great miracle. I want to point out that he did not have to use the lunch. You understand, Jesus did not need the bread and the fish to start out with. He didn't need it at all. He could have materialized food from nothing, just as he could materialize worshipers on the day of the triumphal entry from the very stones. He could materialize food from thin air. In fact, that's what God did for the nation of Israel in the Old Testament when they were wandering in the wilderness. He materialized bread from heaven, manna for them every night. They'd wake up in the morning and there was bread on the ground, just like the dew. I hope it didn't mix together. Soggy bread is not good. You know how manna got its name? The name manna means, what is it? That's what the word manna means. What is it? And that's basically how it got its name. They woke up one day, they were in need of food, and God had promised to be the one that provides for all their needs. They wake up one day and there's bread on the ground, and they all say, what is it? And someone said, that's perfect. Let's call it that. It's, what is it? Manna. That's what the name means, manna. He materialized that from heaven. That's not how nature works. That's not the law of nature right there, to just pop bread on the ground for you. He could have materialized this miracle from nothing. He could have completely avoided using the disciples, and no one would have blamed him because the disciples aren't exactly bursting with faith and good ideas here. Could have put them on the back burner and said, let me just materialize some food to feed the crowd. But he chose to use the food. That little bit, because he's teaching us about ministry. And he's teaching us about his desire for our involvement. It's not about what we have or what we bring. It's just about the fact that we're getting involved in ministry, that we're taking steps of faith, that we're reaching out to people that are in need, understanding that we don't have the goods to meet those needs, but that when God joins with us, God meets the need. Verse 14. For there were about 5,000 men, and we know what that means now. 5,000 heads of homes, 5,000 families. Then he said to his disciples, make them sit down in groups of 50. And they did so, and he made them all, made them all sit down. Pardon me. So Mark chapter 6, verse 40 tells us that the disciples organized them and had them sit down in groups of 100s and 50s. It's surprising that Jesus gave them a part at all. But he didn't exclude them, even though they had no faith for this, that they had no solutions for this, and they didn't even fall back on ministry fail-safe number one. When you get into a ministry situation and you can't meet the needs and you need help, ministry fail-safe number one that they should have down by now is this. When you're out of energy or power to help in a situation of need, that's when you turn to the Lord and you say, Lord, I know that you're able to do this, so will you be willing to meet this need? I mean, they could have at least said that. They could have at least said, Jesus, we can't do it. We're sorry. We want to. We know you can. So will you? You are able, Lord. and if you are willing. It's that kind of praying. Ministry fail-safe number one. They didn't even do that. I mean, how hard is that to remember? When in doubt, ask for the Lord's help. This wasn't their first rodeo. This wasn't their first day at this. For 2 years, they've seen the Lord do the impossible. They've seen Him materialize solutions out of thin air to meet needs. They've seen that there's nothing that can hinder Him when He's determined to do something for someone or pull something off. And yet here they just have nothing. They are completely stumped. Well, Lord, this is impossible. I mean, we know you just raised that little kid from the dead, but this is impossible. We'll just be kind and blame ministry exhaustion for this. Jesus doesn't get mad or impatient with them. He still chooses to involve them. Keep in mind also that just like a day ago, these same 12 men were out on a missionary trip where the Lord was doing miracles through their hands and through their words. They were the vessels that were being used for miracles. None of that just seems to be flooding back into their minds at this moment. They're stuck on the immensity of the need. So he says, okay, let's see what I have to work with here. No faith, no solutions, not asking me for help. But let's see, what can you do? How can I still keep you involved in this great miracle that I'm going to do? What can I use you for? And I can just picture Jesus asking the disciples, Mark, Luke, can you count to 50? Yeah, we can count to 50. John, can you count to 100? Yeah, we can do that. Perfect. I can still use you. Here's what we'll have you do. We'll have you go out. We'll have you organize the people, set them down in 100s and 50s. Can you do that much for me? If you can do a little math, then I can involve you in this. And so they do. And Jesus uses that. See, it's just a great reminder about what we've been talking about, that basic truth that any ability or gifting that you have can be used for the kingdom. We have computer coders that can work for the kingdom. We have mathematicians that can work for the kingdom. Right, treasurer? We have people that are good with encouraging others that can work for the kingdom. You've got some ability that, trust me, God can breathe life into and use to bless other people and use to keep this church humming. Right? Verse 16. Then he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed. Now, everything that's about to happen in this story, this miracle that's going to take place, it all happened because Jesus raised that food, that little bit that they had, and he prayed a prayer of blessing over it. That was it. Lord, bless this food. And from that blessing from Jesus, this miracle was going to pour out. So what the Lord blesses, you just cannot keep down. You cannot hold back. It is going to multiply. Now you know why we Christians, we here at the church, ask the Lord to bless everything. Lord, bless my family. Lord, bless this meal. Lord, bless our fellowship. Lord, bless my finances. Why do we put so much time into praying for the Lord's blessing? Because the Lord's blessing really matters. It can take something that's little, something that's insufficient, and well, I don't want to give away the ending here. Trust me, you want the Lord's blessing over every aspect of your life. And it's as simple as what Jesus did. He just asked for it. He prayed to the Father in heaven and asked for that blessing. If you'll do the same thing, that same blessing will be moving in areas of your life that you asked for blessing on. So if you're not a person that prays that way on a regular basis, if you're not a person that prays for your food and ask the Lord to bless it. If you're not a person that reaches into all the different areas of your life and asks the Lord to bless those areas of your life, can I encourage you to make that a habit today? Make that a thing today in your life. And you can take me to task on it. You'll notice the difference. You'll see it. You'll see the blessing of God coming into those areas of your life. So he blessed them and broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the multitude. It sounds just like communion. He blessed and then he broke off the little pieces and he starts to give that food to the disciples. And then the disciples are going to take that food as he hands it to them, and they're going to take that to the individuals in the crowd. Now, if Jesus wasn't involved in this, this would be a very short experiment. All right, here's one piece of fish, 2 pieces of fish. Oh, sorry, we're out. This isn't going to last long, but this is Jesus in this. And notice again, another aspect of the involvement of the disciples that did not need to be there. Jesus is choosing the most time-consuming way to do this, just so that he can have his disciples involved. Now, we can't ever get confused and think that God needs us. I mean, if you think you're really important, I'm sorry to break your heart today. God doesn't need us. I mean, he's going to accomplish what he's going to accomplish, whether we're in it or not, whether we're working or not. He doesn't necessarily need us, but he wants to use us. He wants us to share in the ministry, because you're going to find out when we get to the end of this passage that one of the incredible things about ministry is what God does for you in the process. So he takes the most time-consuming route. Definitely quicker for Jesus to stand up there with the food, have everyone form a single file line, and have them walk past Jesus and get their little piece of bread and go back in line if they want seconds and thirds and what have you. Definitely quicker. Instead, he's breaking off each piece and handing it to the disciples. They're running it over to the first guy in the crowd, and then they come back and get some more. And it's all this constant running. It's a lot more complicated and a lot more time-consuming. But here's why Jesus did it. It was because by doing it this way, he could get his disciples' hands on the miracle that he was doing. Think about it. The miracle, they were the first people to touch the miracle that Christ was doing. It was happening right at their fingertips, just like we talked about last week. Right at their fingertips, the miracle was happening. They were getting their hands on it, and then they got to not only touch the miracle, not only experience the miracle, then they got the privilege of being the ones to distribute the miracle. Why do I encourage people to get involved in ministry? Because that's what you do. You distribute the things that the Lord is doing in the lives of other people. You get up here to preach a message. You're distributing the Word of God to people, and that changes people's lives. When you lay hands on people to pray for them and the Lord touches them and heals them, what he's doing is he's using you as a vessel to distribute the blessing of God. Who would not want their hands in on that kind of work? I don't do ministry for me. If ministry was about me, I would not want to get up here every week. I would not want to have the responsibilities that I have every week. I would just be home with my Bible, studying and getting and receiving from God. But I do ministry because just like the disciples, I get to get my hands on the things that the Lord is doing. I get to see things that other people don't because they're not involved in the work. They're not distributing what the Lord is doing. They're not taking what little they have. And believe me, I understand that what I have is very little in comparison to where I could be or where I want to be. I get up here every week with those inadequacies and insufficiencies. I feel like every week I'm saying, Lord, all I have is 5 little pieces of pita bread and 2 little sardines. That's all I got. But Lord, if you'll breathe your life into this, I know you can do stuff through this. And that's where my joy comes from, seeing where I end, which is pretty quick, and seeing where the Lord takes over and watching the Lord do what he does, seeing people's hearts set free, people's homes set free, people's lives changed by his miracle working power. Verse 17, so they all ate and were filled. And the word there in the Greek means to be gorged or glutted. In other words, they stuffed themselves to the gills with the fish. Completely stuffed. They gorged on the food. In John chapter 6, verse 11, it says that the people ate as much as they wanted. Well, of course they did. It was a free meal. I mean, you know how you eat when it's on someone else's dime. The same way you eat when you've just dropped $8 at a buffet and you think to yourself, this restaurant is going to lose money on me today. So, of course, they ate as much as they wanted. They kept it coming. This was a free meal. It wasn't costing them anything. They're eating and eating until they're glutted on the food. I wanted so bad to bring this message forward last week, like right before our potluck. This would have been perfect timing if we could have got this to work out, and this was right before the potluck. But I think it worked out anyway, because last week at the potluck, we ran out of chocolate pie. And I heard rumors that when there was just that one piece of chocolate pie left, that the church membership started fighting over that one piece. And I thought to myself, see, this kind of stuff doesn't happen when the Lord blesses and multiplies the food. And I should have stopped once I got the report. I should have stopped and I should have laid my hands on that piece of pie and prayed for the Lord to bless that. Or an even greater miracle would have been for me to take the extra pie, the extra chocolate pie that was in the refrigerator that had been made specifically for my family. That would have been a great miracle to get me to give that up. I'm sorry to say I didn't have the heart. I didn't think about it. But they don't run out here. You remember what they started with, practically nothing. And the food just keeps coming and no one really knows what's happening. That's the way the Lord works. That's the way miracles are. You're never going to be able to explain it or understand it. The good just keeps coming. The healing just keeps coming. The power just keeps coming. And before long, everyone is completely satiated and satisfied. In other words, the need stopped before the provision was out. And not only that, but it says 12 baskets of leftover fragments were taken up by them. Did you hear what I just said? That's what they ended up with. You remember what they started with? Pita bread, couple sardines. That's what they started with. They ended up with 12 baskets of leftovers. How does that happen? It doesn't happen unless the Lord is involved. Why 12? The Lord did not need to do this. This was overkill, church. We'd have been blown out of our minds if we just read about there being one full basket of leftovers. That's still more than what they started with. It still shows us the power of God's provision for the people that He loves and cares for. We'd have been equally impressed with that. But Jesus, when it's all said and done, has 12 baskets of leftovers. You know why that is? Because how many disciples are there? There's one basket for each disciple that at the beginning of this miracle had no faith and didn't know what Christ was capable of doing. This was Christ's way of sending each of them home with a basket and saying, here's some leftovers. Chew on that for a while. When you're eating your leftovers for 2 weeks, that's going to give you 2 weeks to think about what I did here. And maybe through those 2 weeks of eating the leftovers and chewing on the meaning of what happened, maybe that's going to be enough to make you think twice in the future about ever believing for just a moment that there could ever possibly be a need that is so great, so gigantic, that I cannot satisfy that need. And so there it is. We end with this. Worship team, you can come on up. We end with this. One of the great secrets of ministry is that the minister, so the servant, the one that's helping brothers and sisters, that the servant is always blessed way more than they bless other people in ministry. Why am I addicted to ministry? That's not a bad word cluster there, by the way. Paul referred in the New Testament to the house of Stephanas as being addicted to the ministry. Why am I addicted to the ministry? Because what little I do for God, He somehow, in spite of me, uses that, and then what I end up with at the end is way more than I ever offered in the beginning. They offered the 5 loaves and the 2 little fish. That was it. It was mutual. It was among the group. It wasn't even individual. That was what they offered. That's what they started with. But what did they end up with? Well, they were full, first off. They were stuffed. It's one of those after Sunday collapse on the couch kind of stuffed. And they had leftovers. They ended up with way more than what they started with. So if you're not ministry minded today, if you have no concern in your heart over helping brothers and sisters that are around you or reaching out to the lost and hurting people of this world, we're not going to try to push you into that just yet. I'm not recruiting. This isn't a speech. But these are messages for you to tuck in the back of your mind and remember for later after the Lord has had some time to work in your life and show you these things and do incredible things at your fingertips. And take what you start with and then give you at the end of it way more than what you started with. When the Lord starts doing those kind of things in your life and you start to get that kind of heart, that kind of compassion that Jesus had on this crowd in the beginning. When the disciples said, send them away, the scriptures tell us, Jesus saw the multitudes and had compassion on them because they were like sheep that didn't have a shepherd. And when you get that kind of compassion in your heart for other people and you want to start moving in ministry, you want to start reaching out to bless others, I hope that you'll remember these things that we're learning about ministry. I hope you'll come back to these 2 teachings and continue to learn and just flow in that. Just get in that flow of ministry that we've been talking about. You get to be the middleman and you get to distribute the things that the Lord's doing. You get your hands on the work that God is doing in the church and in the world. That's an incredible blessing and privilege.